Here we are on the plugins page of Moodle. The first thing we're able to do is to install plugins. There are various ways that you can achieve this. If you have linked your site to moodle.org, you're able to install plugins from the Moodle plugins directory, the main system there. You do have to authorize against moodle.org, but then that's a very simple way to install plugins. As an alternative, you can download a zip file from that Moodle plugins area, or indeed from other suppliers, and then unzip the file here. And of course, if you're a advanced administrator, you may be using Git or similar systems to ensure that your plugins are up to date. So there's various different approaches to installing plugins. The low tech, using the zip file, the kind of medium tech approach of using the GUI and ensuring your site is registered with moodle.org to do that, or indeed using Git. There's a plugins overview. This is an incredibly useful page. First of all, it shows us every plugin that's currently installed in Moodle, and of course a lot of the core features that you see in Moodle, such as folders and the database activity and various authentication systems. These are all in fact plugins. Of course, blocks, which many people recognize as being plugins, but most of the things that you'll see in here are in fact now plugins, and that is a key part of the Moodle architecture, to make sure that everything as much as possible is a plugin, so that developers can write new modules and plugins that the Moodle world can then install and use. The other reason this page is very useful is because it shows us a quick link to additional plugins, to non-standard plugins. So on this site I can see there's one additional plugin that's not part of the core Moodle code. As it happens, in this case it's a theme, it's the essential theme, and I can check for available updates on any of my plugins just by using that button there, and it will check against the latest version, the latest build, and if required I can then install that directly from there, actually update it from there. So very useful. I'm not going to go through every option in the plugins area, because this is something that as an administrator you need to work through when you're setting up your site initially, and then sometimes revisit these things afterwards. But if we look at the main types of plugins to understand how these are organized, first of all we have all our activity plugins. So they're the things like the label and the lesson and the quiz. We have some admin tools, the antivirus, authentication plugins. They will be important when initially setting up your site. Blocks, a major feature of Moodle traditionally. Caching, course formats. It is possible to install additional course formats into Moodle. Not every administrator is aware of that. Enrollment plugins. Quite a lot of enrollment plugins and third-party plugins are available. The same is true of filters. And we then have some other plugins that you'll probably be familiar with, at least passingly. Media player plugins, message outputs, question types. It is possible to add extra question types into Moodle. Reports, lots of reports that you can add into Moodle. And then finishing off with repositories. Lots of those are enabled, or a number of those are enabled by default, but you can add new repositories such as YouTube or Dropbox and so on. The global search, which is available now in Moodle, that does need the Solar extension installing and setting up on the server. It's not a case of just switching that on and it works. You do need to install some additional systems on the server itself. And then finishing off with text editors, which again are plugins. Atto, which is the newer plugin for the editor, the standard plugin, and TinyMCE, which is the older one from Moodle 2 days, and web services. So let's just pick one or two of these to investigate. So for example, with the quiz module, if I click on the quiz module, we can see there are lots of values and options in here that we can set, and these are kind of defaults. So if we know that on your site the majority of quizzes are set to 15 minutes because they are kind of test your own knowledge exercises, then we could alter that value and that then becomes the default. It can obviously be overridden every time a teacher creates a quiz, but that now becomes the default. So clearly that could be a time saver for teachers having to think about and change that value all the time, but they can override it. So lots of settings in here that relate directly to the quizzes. So again, the default is to allow unlimited attempts. You may be using the quiz for end of course assessment, in which case you can bring that down to 3, and therefore again the default will be 3. That can be overridden by the teacher. So here in the quiz, lots of options that you are able to set as the administrator that will have a direct impact upon teachers as they create and use, and students of course, as they create and as teachers create and students use these activities. And that's exactly the same for every activity in here. So if you are aware that the chat module is being used a lot within Moodle, go and visit your chat setup page, think about the settings that's actually using there, and maybe alter some of those to make sure they're the most appropriate settings for your site and how you need things to work. There are of course some areas that you will need to work with IT or with the wider organization. For example, authentication. There are lots of authentication options. If you enable the email-based self-registration, then one of the things you can do there is enable reCAPTCHA, which will help stop so many spam accounts being created. So a nice obvious one for admins to look into. With blocks, we think of blocks as being very simple, straightforward elements, and that's very true. But if we, for instance, go into activity results, we can see that even there in a very simple block, there are some key options, key default options that you can change as the admin to perhaps make this better, for everyone. Not every teacher is going to understand the settings involved in every block, so you could take a little bit of time and work through what the most appropriate defaults are going to be. And it may be that you think, well, most people will actually want a top 10 in their activity results, so we'll change that to 10 rather than 3. In many of these menus, you will also have, as well as the access to the individual, in this case blocks, you'll also have a manage option at the top. So we have manage course formats, we have manage blocks, we have manage authentication. And that first option will generally allow you to switch on and off all these different elements. So if I decide across our site we don't need the calendar for whatever reason, I can simply come in here as the admin and switch that off just by clicking on the I. That now means that every calendar block that had been used across the site is now hidden, and in this case there was one, so you need to consider those two things together if you're going to make changes here. And the other thing this does, of course, is give you direct access again to those settings. So if I wanted to look at the settings available for the courses block, then I can also click on settings here and change those. So lots of options, and in a short video like this, it's really not possible to go through every single setting clearly. It is, however, important to realise that there are lots of settings in each of these modules, each of these blocks or authentication methods or course formats, and really the administrator is the only person that can look at these and make some sensible decisions around potentially overriding those default settings. It may well be that you want to involve academic staff and teachers and other IT in these decisions. That is important. Moodle is ultimately about delivering the content and that experience, so teachers can create and facilitate courses, learners can take and access courses, and don't assume that just because you've installed Moodle and switched some of these things on, that they do not need to be revisited and configured carefully.